she said to me, high functioning anxiety sufferer. But then she said to me, but it's going to get harder and harder for you to maintain your mental health the older you get. Because as you know, we get hardwired, we get habit-based. And that's why it's easier to learn a new language at 50 than it is at 20 than it is at 50. And that for me was terrible. At the time, sorry, it's probably a bit too much information, but just to give context, at the time I was fairly suicidal. I don't think I ever would have suicided, to be quite honest. I was too responsible. And secondly, too much of a chicken. How do you actually do it? But these were the thoughts that were going through my head at the time. And I just remember thinking to myself, I've got to do something about this. And so the Below the Line journey has been a real deep dive into how I'm wired. Is it nature? Is it nurture? And really understanding why I had those feelings. And so I'd say to you, those of you who have had experience of anxiety or know people with anxiety, I don't think you're ever not an anxiety sufferer. But what I have learned to do is to manage it far more than it manages me. So that's a bit of the below the line context, which has had a deep impact on the work I do above the line. So I'll just fast forward and tell you that the way I describe myself now is actually as an alignment and movement strategist. And I use the words quite deliberately. People will often say to me, is that like a chiropractor or maybe a massage therapist or something along those lines? And yeah, probably it is. But I use the words quite deliberately because I want to frame myself rather than people frame me. So I'm sure you've all had this experience. Peter introduced me as a coach. In fact, I never introduced myself as a coach. And fundamentally, do I coach? Yes. Am I a coach? No, I don't think so. And so the context why I say that is that if you've had a positive experience with a coach, that's probably a good thing. If you've had a negative experience, that's probably not such a good thing. But in any context, you still have a picture of what a coach does. And that framing, I've always struggled against. I've always been a bit left field. So I describe myself as an alignment and movement frame strategist. And I want to just share with you briefly, and that's why I asked Peter if I could share the screen, what this looks like. And then I want to share a model with you, which might be helpful. Just hopefully you can see the screen. It should just be a blank page that says alignment and movement with X model at the top.
Yeah.
And please, if you guys have questions, feel free to just ask a comment in the chat or just put your hand up. And Peter, if you could watch for that, that would be wonderful. So the way I describe what I do is as an X model, and I work both organizationally and I work individually. I'm really fortunate in the organizational context to work typically at the board level or at the leadership team level. And there are 4 key questions that I would ask. And these are questions that I know you would all be familiar with, but I'll just give you a quick context. The first question is, why do you exist? Either why do you exist as an organization, or why do you exist as a leadership team, or why do you exist with the board, depending on the context. But a real sense of what's your purpose? Why are you there? The second question is, what does success look like? So success for me is multifaceted. It's both tangible and intangible success. It's also both near and far-term success. So an example of tangible short-term success might be a revenue number. An example of an intangible far-term or long-term indicator of success might be a major culture change project, some multi-year culture change project. So these 2 questions really frame a lot of the work I do organizationally. And hopefully it will surprise you, but the reality is that many companies don't do this well. They do this, but they don't really allow them to frame themselves, which are 2 critical questions. The third one is a checkpoint question. So why do you exist? What does success look like? Where are you now? And the last one is, how are you going to get there? And again, my experience is that companies tend to jump to the how am I going to get there really quickly. And how am I going to get there is fundamentally strategy. Again, my experience is companies tend to almost make the word strategy some sort of a myth, some sort of something special. And the fact is that strategy is really just the actions you're going to take to achieve your success, to get there, as it were. So I'm sure this is not a surprise for people, but this is the work I do organizationally. I also do individual alignment work. And so the reality is, in every organization, you have people, you have an individual working with them who's also on a journey to success. And the overlap with the organization is this thing we call the job or the role. And in some contexts, sorry, let me just quickly add a, Peter, am I allowed to, are you enable me to write on it? It doesn't look like, I don't see I have that option.
I think, Brian, that would depend on your computer, not at my end.
Okay, yeah, so I don't see how I could do that based on my...
You'll have to go off full screen, Brian.
Okay, great. Well, let me get off full screen. It's okay. It's not a problem. I'll just keep going. What I was going to draw on the slide was I talk about this relationship. The work I do around organizational and individual alignment is around a win-win relationship. So in other words, it's a win for the company to have the individual, if it's the right price point, right skills, right experience, right personality. And it's a win for the individual to be working for the company if it's a good, good brand, right price point, and he's taking them on the journey towards success. The problem comes when that win-win relationship changes to a lose for either party. And so if it changes to a lose from an organizational perspective, this is where they will come to the individual and they will use some sort of words like, thank you, it's been good, but we no longer have a role for you. It will be words along those lines. This happens all the time. It may even have happened in your context. It has definitely happened in my context. And that's okay. But my experience is that the individual's not done the work on their journey to the extent that the company's done the work. And so what happens is that this can cause a lot of damage because the individual often has identified with the organization or with a role. And when the company comes along to them and says, thank you, but we don't have a role for you anymore, that can cause a lot of damage. And so and then similarly, if it turns from a win to lose from the individual, the problem is that because they're not clear of their journey, they tend to stay too long, which does damage to themselves, does damage to the company, does damage to family and friends, and it's not a good thing. So fundamentally, the work is around helping organizations align, but also helping individuals align and be aware of that journey. You'll notice I also talk about alignment and movement. The movement piece for me is really interesting. I added movement about 3 years ago because my observation is, in fact, the way I would describe the work I do is not about finding an answer, but it is about creating movement. And the way I just talk about it is creating movement in an aligned direction. And so fundamentally, that's the work I do. And yes, of course, there's a context of coaching in that. There's a context of transition, of change. But fundamentally, I would say to you, probably 40% of the work I do is organizational alignment. Probably 40% of the work I do is individual alignment, so working with individuals. And the remaining 20% is a combination where I'm working with the organization and the leadership team at the same time, individually and corporately. Hopefully that gives you some context around what it is I do. And I'm sure, hopefully you'll instinctively understand the context that I'm coming from. Let me just stop at that point and just ask if there's any questions. Peter, I don't know if you can pick up in the chat if there's any questions or if anyone would like to comment on what I've just shared.
Sure, I think it's easiest if people just unmute themselves and ask directly.
Cool. Any questions, anyone?
Yeah, hi Brian. This is Tracy. Thanks for the presentation. It was really good. I was just wondering, how long does this journey or how long do you typically intervene, both for companies and for individuals? I imagine it's multiple sessions for both. Maybe it depends on the person and their circumstances, but do you have kind of an idea of what is that?
Yeah, Tracy, we have a great expression in South Africa. I'm not sure if there's any South Africans on the call, but the expression is ja nee, which literally translated into into English is yes, no. So the answer is yes, no, both and. Excuse me. It really depends on the individual and it depends on the organization. Some people are far more thoughtful and prepared for the discussion, others aren't. I've actually found, so as I mentioned to you, I do a lot of work individually with people. Some of them are referred through organizations. If they feel the organization wants them to do that, that actually takes longer because they're not quite ready to do the work. But it's, I would even say to you, in one sense, it's a lifetime journey of increasingly getting to know yourself. The way I describe myself is that I am increasingly becoming the person I was designed to be. Have I arrived? No. Is the past a waste? No. It's all leading to a point of me increasingly becoming the person I was designed to be. And I know that sounds a bit esoteric, but I'm sure you'd agree that there's a uniqueness about all of us. There's a uniqueness about our skills, experience, personality, backstory. Backstory is critical to the journey that we're on, is understanding that. And that's last 10 years is what I've done, and is gone back and understood my past. And I mentioned to you, when I introduced myself, that I'd struggled with imposter syndrome. I always thought I was restless and discontent. So every 3, 4, 5, 6 years, I would move jobs. I now realize I was so worried that I was going to get caught out. So I would move before they discovered that, that was a lot of it was in my head, but that was the reality. So I'm giving you a long roundabout answer. It depends so much on the individual. It depends so much on the organization. I do find though, if the person's ready, 4 or 5 sessions can get them moving very solidly forward.
Great, yeah, thank you. I'm you don't like the word a career coach.
Oh, great.
So it's quite interesting, hearing this, what you're saying, and you, in your answer, you touched on something that I do with clients as well. That's the design part. I'm working on who I'm designed to be. So that's quite
great. And please, if you call yourself a career coach, that's wonderful. It's just my own personal preference, because I find people tend to box me, and you would understand how important one personal narrative is.
Yes.
As opposed to anything else.
I do. Yeah. Thanks, Brian.
No problem. So what I said to Peter is I wanted to share a framework with you, giving that context, a framework with you, which I found quite helpful to help people situate themselves in their own journey. So I call it the looping model, and it's not brain surgery, you'll get it really quickly. It looks like this, and as all good consultants, it's a 2x2 matrix. So to give you a brief description of it, the top is enjoyment or engagement. If I'm talking to a company, I talk engagement because that's corporate speak. If I'm talking to an individual, I talk enjoyment. Because we know if you're enjoying something, your engagement is going to be high and vice versa. So the top axis is enjoyment ranging from high to low. The left is performance ranging from low to high. And so the way it works with this is you start a new job, and invariably you start in quadrant 1. Quadrant 1 is you're not performing, but you are enjoying it. It doesn't mean you can't perform. It just means you're trying to figure out who's who in the zoo, trying to figure out how things work, trying to understand your role. Over time, you then move into quadrant 2. Quadrant 2 is high performing, high enjoyment. I actually call this quadrant the warm, fuzzy quadrant. This is where you're on the, in the car, on the tram, in the train, and you get the warm, fuzzy feeling. And it's a little bit of that, oh, I love my job, that sense of feeling. Hopefully all of you in the room, in the call have experienced that at some time. But it's a real sense of, this is it, I've arrived, I love my job, I'm performing, I'm enjoying it. The tension is that you tend not to stay there. You think you arrived, but things change. You get a new boss, company changes. I'm working with a guy at the moment who is really loving it in quadrant 2. Company's just been acquired by someone else, and things have changed, and it is moved. It could also be change in personal circumstances, but ultimately everyone begins to move into quadrant 3. And I call quadrant 3, you'll see it's still performing, but not enjoying. So if you're in a situation of ever managing people or yourself, my observation is that drop in enjoyment comes before drop in performance. We tend to wait until drop in performance, but that's almost too late. And so again, I'm sorry that I can't draw on the screen for you, but I described my model of sustainability as like a savings account. And I talk about, if you know what deposits into that savings account and you know what withdraws out of that savings account, and provided you make sure that what deposits is way more than what withdraws, you are in more of a sustainable context. The reality is in quadrant 1 and 2, that's definitely what's depositing is more than what's withdrawing. Quadrant 3 starts to equalize. I talk about this is where you have to turn up the treadmill. This is where, if you're in a work context on a Sunday night, you get a bit of a sick feeling in your stomach because you know what's coming during the week. Or you've got an important meeting and you just like, gee, I'd love to take, a mental health day, or I'm not sure I really want to be there. This is where it starts to equalize, and it's not bad. It's very normal and natural. But the reality is, if you don't deal with it at that point, you will begin to drop into quadrant 4, because it's impossible to maintain performance if you're not enjoying what you do. And so quadrant 4 is you're not performing, you're not enjoying things. I call quadrant 4 the coffee shop quadrant. This is where you get an invite from your boss to go and have a coffee. And he says to you, or she says to you something along the lines of, look, Brian, I can see you're not enjoying it. Your performance is a little low. Maybe we should come to some sort of agreement. And you end up leaving, not necessarily in a good space, knowing that you've gone, I describe it as off the end of the runway. Quadrant 3, you're coming to the end of the runway. And so the context of this is understanding where you are in your career journey, in the journey that you're on, helps you understand what's going on with yourself. So I would say to you, quadrant 1 to 3 is a very normal process. Quadrant 3, you have a couple of options. This is sometimes where you get a call from a headhunter who says to you, I've got a great job. And even before they've stopped speaking, you've said yes. And that's okay, provided if you're very clear about what you want to go towards, as opposed to getting away from something. It's very hard to move back into quadrant 2 if you've settled into quadrant 3. And as I say, if you don't deal with quadrant 3, you drop into quadrant 4. So the interesting part for me is when I look at enjoyment or engagement, I have 2 key factors that I believe indicate to me where someone is. The 2 key factors are, firstly, understanding and helping people do what they love to do, a really important part. The second is getting their needs met healthily. And so when I check in with people, I listen carefully for those 2 things. And invariably, if they identify as quadrant 3 or 4, it's because they're either not doing what they love, or they're not getting their needs met, or both. And being able to step back, reassess that, allows them to move back into quadrant 1 and 2. Let me stop there for a second. I've gone through this quite quickly, and just ask if anyone have questions at this stage in terms of the model.
Yeah, I have a question, Brian. In how often, are people able to get from the yellow box, quadrant 3 back into quadrant 2?
Yeah, great. Is that you, Kokon?
Yeah, that's me.
Great. My personal experience is that it's very hard to go from 3 to 2, particularly when you're settled in 3, because something fundamentally needs to change. So let me talk a little bit about what you love to do. If I said to people on the call, tell me a little bit about what you love to do, my experience is people can normally verbalize that. We might need to do a bit of work on the narrative. We might need to do a bit of work on how they express that. But generally, they're able to identify elements of what they love to do. The second part, understanding your needs and getting them met healthily, is a little hard to verbalize. And it's often what I call below the surface. And so we talk about, we're not enjoying our roles because we're not enjoying what we're doing. But fundamentally, that's not often the problem. It's really around our deeper needs. So to give you a quick context, give you a personal story around myself. I mentioned to you when I came to Australia 2001, I came to run the web development business. It was really stressful. 6 weeks later, I was closing it. And I'd go to my boss at the time. His name was Steve. He was the CEO. And I'd say to Steve, how am I doing? Am I doing a good job? Am I doing the right things? I realized on hindsight, I was looking for affirmation. I was looking for Steve to say, mate, doing a great job, looking for feedback. I call them hugs, whether they be verbal or virtual hugs, but I was looking for a hug. Now, unfortunately, Steve as an individual didn't do hugs, and the company culture didn't do hugs. Company culture was not a feedback-based culture. It was actually very blokey, and it was seen as a weakness if you were looking for feedback. So ultimately, I didn't get my need met. And so I ended up leaving there, and I've always reflected back on the year and a half I spent with the company as a failure. With the last 10 years and going to understand how I'm wired, looking at my brain, neuroscience, etc., I actually realized that my need for affirmation was quite valid. The problem was I was looking in the wrong place for that need to be met. I was looking to Steve, I was looking to the organization. So recognizing that, I've done a lot of work over the last 10 years to actually manage, to get my needs met healthily. And I've got a couple of small hacks that I do that means that I no longer need that from a Steve or from the organization. If they say you're doing if I was working with a client and they said, Brian, you're doing a great job, that would be great, but I no longer need it. And so the tension for me, Kakong, is that if you're in quadrant 3, one of those two, or probably both, particularly if you're settling, is out of alignment. And so it's very difficult to move back into quadrant 2 without going through 1 again. And there's this process of resetting yourself. And invariably, that will probably happen in a new organization, because it's very hard to do that in an existing organization. So I felt, I was very comfortably in quadrant 3 when I was in that role that I mentioned later. There were times where I bounced back into quadrant 2, but then I'd slip back into quadrant 3 because fundamentally I wasn't getting my needs met. I was doing what I loved, but I wasn't getting my needs met. And when I look back now, part of the problem is I needed to totally reset into a context where I knew how to get my needs met healthily, as opposed to expected from the organization. So it's a long answer, but I guess my observation is that very hard to go back to quadrant 2 without going through quadrant 1. And as I understand, many of you on the call are going through a process of transition. And so in some ways, you have a real opportunity to reset yourself into quadrant 1, not the not performing part, but be able to set yourself into a context of what it is I love to do. What do I understand my needs and how to get them healthily? Okay, that sets me into a context of being able to transition through this, through the model. Kakong, does that sort of help?
Yeah, yeah, it does actually. It does. I mean, just two thoughts there. I mean, one is that understanding what your needs are, to get you back into quadrant 2 or even quadrant 1, and understanding what you love to do. That's something that's not so easily discerned, I think, for a lot of people. I think that's one comment. So I'm keen to hear what hacks you're going to share with us in a moment.
Yes.
But the other thing is that when what's interesting with this model is I just see because I've been recruiting for many years. So, if people are in quadrant 3, obviously they respond to a call very quickly. But what happens is that as you become, I'm going to say older, but also kind of more experienced and higher up in the food chain, companies want people who don't stay in quadrant 1 for a long time. They want people who are capable of moving out of quadrant 1 very quickly into quadrant 2. So I think that's why it gets harder for more experienced people to get a new role, because the companies are looking, they have a much tighter spec, and so as a candidate, I'm just thinking, how do you respond to that? It probably, maybe it's about figuring out where and what types of role where you're going to be able to perform almost straight away.
Yeah, I agree. I think most I have when I look at this model, I review my previous job, and it looks like it's a two-way street. You need to reset yourself to find what you enjoy the most. But it still depends on your boss whether he is cooperating or he is just simply. My case was I enjoyed doing the stuff, so I was in quadrant 2. Then there's a change of management. My direct supervisor who trusted me left the company, and then his subordinate becomes that role. And very soon I was in the quadrant 3, the yellow quadrant area. I try to cooperate, try to figure out what he wants, and then some moments later I got the package. So I think in the first day I was not trusted by that supervisor.
It is interesting. I observe generations are often very different. So I'm a baby boomer, and most baby boomers took from 1 to 3 took anything from 5 to 15 years to get from 1 to 3. Millennials, my experience is, get from 1 to 3 within 3 to 6 months. And so the interesting bit is that millennials generally tend to be managed by baby boomers or people that are older than them. And so what happens is they'll go to their boss and they'll say, okay, I need something new. I know this stuff now. And they'll say, no, I had this as a software developer. I started as a trainee programmer, and then I became a junior programmer, and then I became a programmer, and then I was a senior programmer. And you had to spend a certain amount of time at each of those. So to say to a millennial, look, you need to spend at least 3 years in this role before we'll move you or promote you, that for them is not, it's not what I'm doing. I'm out of here. So people respond very differently to this. And I'll just give it to you as a model for 2 reasons. Firstly, to get a sense of where you sit and to understand your natural movement as you grow, as you mature, as you get more experienced. And I think, Kokong, what you're saying is that, yes, clearly organizations don't want you to come in at quadrant 1. They want you to be performing straight away. But if you reflect for yourself, why do we do 90-day plans or 100-day plans? Is to get people going as quickly as they can into quadrant 2. The key thing is to maintain yourself in quadrant 2 for as long as possible. I believe those 2 things need to be aligned. You need to generally, there's never any job that 100% you love everything, but I believe it's got to be at least 70% that you enjoy. And the focus of the job has to be on something that you love. Just as a quick aside, about 4 years ago, I worked with the CFO of a company. And I would say to you, he wasn't in a good place. He was in quadrant 3. And as I met him and discussed with him, he was allergic to numbers. He did not like numbers. Now, you might say, how's that possible as a CFO? Let me tell you, this guy faked it. He started out, he went and did accounting because his parents said to him, great job, you always get a job. So he went through, joined one of the large professional firms, became a partner, then got a role as a CFO. then moved into another role as a CFO, and eventually just couldn't maintain that momentum anymore, and was, operating very much in the still performing, but not enjoying. And the head of HR asked me to do some work with him because he was beginning to drop into quadrant 4. So all we did was, the work I did with him was really trying to understand, so what is it you love to do? And he didn't love numbers. And yet that was the focus of his job. As we unpacked it, it was very clear that the parts that he did role, and we were able to change his role to that of a corporate services role, where finance was part of that, but he could outsource finances to a financial controller or to a finance director, still maintain overall responsibility for it. So it's this element of self-understanding. I do a lot of work with people in the leadership development space, and I would say to you that as people develop, it almost starts with self-awareness. People tend to think they are self-aware, and I'm sure you have bosses who think they're very self-aware, but the reality, self-awareness is just the first step. The second step becomes self-understanding. Understand why you respond in a certain way, understand why you trigger people. The third step then for me becomes self-acceptance. And I find many people don't actually get to that space. And then finally, it's self-moderation or self-development, where you actually do something about it. And so this for me is a model as part of that journey of understanding yourself. And if you're feeling unsettled, so when I talk to people and I'm listening carefully to them, I'll then share this model and I'll say, tell me, so where do you feel yourself? Where are you at? And people will be invariably able to identify very quickly that they 2, 3, or even 4. Then we have something, we've identified an issue which we can then work with. And that's, to go to Kokong's comment around, it's not easy. Tracy and others that work in the space, that's the magic of what we do, is actually help people verbalize what it is that they love to do, and help them identify and put in habits and a mechanism that helps them get their needs met healthily, so that they come more fully formed to a job, they come more self-aware to a job, and less dependent upon the role. I'm rambling on a bit there, guys. Any other questions or comments that you might have?
Sorry.
Okay, go ahead, Amy.
Sorry. Hi, Brian. I just had a question. So you were saying that sometimes to go back to the second quadrant, you have to start back at 1 again. When you say that, do you mean starting a new role, or can you actually do that in your current role?
You can do that in your current role if you change things around yourself. So I'm not saying you can't move back to 2. So what my experience is, you move from 2, you start to bounce into 3, but then you bounce back to 2. And so there's some weeks that are amazing and some weeks that are not so amazing. There's some days that are really good and there's some days that aren't so good. But slowly you begin to tip. Slowly you tip increasingly into quadrant 3. And the moment you start to settle into quadrant 3 as almost the norm, that's very hard to go back to 3. That's where I'm saying you need to reset something. And that's why typically moving back into quadrant 1. One of the easier ways to reset is to start a new role in a new company. You can do it in your existing company and in your existing role, but it actually needs quite a lot of self-awareness to do that. And so it's hard to do that, because what happens is when you've worked in an organization in a role for a particular period of time, you tend to become boxed, and it's hard to reset that box. My mother died a few years ago at 92. There were still times when she treated me like I was that 15-year-old. And so it happens in an organizational context, particularly if you've been in a company for a period of time. You take on the norms, you take on the expectations, and you begin to be who you think they are. So, I think you can move back into 2, but not if you're quite well settled into 3. I think the easiest way to get yourself back into 2 is via 1. And that's through, a reset, through recalibrating, through really understanding your deeper drivers.
Yeah, and when you say to do it within the same organization, you need a reset, is that going back to what you were saying about those 4 steps? So the self-awareness, understanding, acceptance, and sorry, what was the 4th one? I missed that.
Yeah, the 4th one I talk about as self-development or self-moderation in some way. So it's actually doing some work. So let me explain that a little bit better. The self-awareness is really the understanding that we impact people. We impact people in different ways, and being aware of how we impact, being aware that we do impact people, that our moods do affect other people, that there is an effect. Now, that for me is just the very first step, is acknowledging that we impact people. The second step is understanding why we impact people. You know, as a South African, people have said to me, I'm very direct. And you know, trying to understand why they perceive that. Is it the way I say it? Is it the way what I bring to it? Is it my accent? Why is that? So that self-understanding piece is an important, I think, a really important piece. You know, the last 10 years is I've always been pretty self-aware. I would say to you, I've been over self-aware and so become immobilized. Understanding myself has really opened up myself to being self-accepting. So it's led me to that next space, to realizing that I do blow it. I get it right, but I get it wrong a lot of the times. I don't mean to, I mean well, but I do that. Okay, deep breath. Now, what can I do about it? That's that next step. So I see life as a continual process of increasingly becoming the people we designed to be, of increasingly doing the work on ourselves. One of my huge breakthroughs in my struggle with anxiety was realizing that I never arrive. I was always working to arrive. And so arrival can take on many different contexts. In a professional context, it could take on a particular amount of money that you want to earn. It could take on a title. It could take on any of these things. And it's one of the reasons why I struggle with the word career and career ladder, because most people will not achieve the level that they think they would have. I know as a baby boomer, we started out thinking, you know, you've arrived if you become IT director or CEO. Most people never get to that level. And so they're living in this tension of having failed. No, I think that's, you know, that for me is a context that's not helpful. And therefore I talk about, you know, as opposed to have arrived, I would say to you, have I grown this year? Am I a better person? Have I developed skills this year? And that's been really helpful for me personally to change what I saw as success. So when I take people through that individual alignment process, fundamentally, I'm asking them the same questions I'm asking the organization. I'm asking them, why do they exist? I know that's an esoteric question, but the reality is that that's part of your meaning and purpose. You know, Steve Jobs used to say in his biographies, he would say his meaning and purpose in life was to put a ding in the universe. And the way he put a ding was, you know, founded Apple and did all these amazing things. So my question to people I work with is, what is your ding? I'm very clear. My ding is to see the lights go on in people's eyes and in organizational eyes. Help them make choices that allow them to live more sustainable, more fulfilling lives. My ding isn't to found an Apple, you know, or to be the CEO of a major company. So that's the first question. Why do I exist? The second question is, what does success look like? And I look at that both short and long term, both tangible and intangible. And I think we're so hard on ourselves. I would say to you that one of the biggest issues I see with clients is discontentment. We're not content with what we do have. We're always wanting more. And so for me, that success piece is a really important part of the work that I do, is helping people define it in a context that is meaningful to them and is not necessarily determined by society, by the organization, by the company. The third question is, so where are you now? And then the last question is, how are you going to get there? And I've got a bit off track, Amy. I'm sorry. Oh, you were talking about those 4 steps, yes. And so I think it's a continual journey of learning and understanding oneself far better. And as I was saying to you, I'm increasingly becoming the person I was designed to be. And the work I would do with people and the work you do yourself, I'm sure, is about increasingly becoming the person you were designed to be. And whether you see yourself as spiritual, a Christian, or spiritual in some context, or as an atheist, I'm sure you would agree there's a uniqueness about all of us. And that's what I think is the amazing journey that we're on, is to unpack that more and more and understand the impact that we do have.
We might thank you, Brian. We might sort of take 1 or 2 final short questions or short answers, perhaps I should say.
Yeah, sorry. I get excited about the stuff. Sorry, guys.
No, that's great. It's great. And then we will go to some breakout groups, because that way everyone gets more chance to interact. Cool. And we'll have obviously one group that Kokong will lead in the boardroom, and then we'll have 2 online groups. So, but before we do that, were there other quick?
Right, Daniel here, Brian. Yes, I'm a career coach. I use that word with a degree of, I think, identity.
Yep, great.
I was curious whether you find that people go from 1 to 3. That's my first question. And the second question is, do you advise people, whether in the second quadrant, sometimes after 5 years, to say, look, it's time to move on before you move into 3?
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And great being a career coach. Again, guys, I didn't want to put you off with that. So the ideal is to be able to self-maintain yourself in this process. So to stay as long as you can in quadrant 2 is really good. My reality is that I believe that life, people develop, people change, things happen, that I observe 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 is almost the process people go to. But not getting stuck in 3 is recognizing what I describe is that you're coming towards the end of your runway, and understanding why you're coming to the end of the runway, I think, is the critical one. And then being able to adjust and self-manage, and with the support of career coaches, to be able to reset yourself through that process. Daniel, you did ask, there were 2 questions. The first question, 1, 2, 3, can you just mention it?
1, 2, 3. Do you find some of your clients go from 1 to 3? They never actually arrive.
Oh, yes. So I find about 10, 20% of people say they've never been in 2.
Yeah.
They've never experienced what that feels like. Sometimes they're being very hard on themselves. Sometimes they actually just don't understand how they're wired and what it feels like. But yes, I do find some people don't identify with 2 at all.
Mm. Good. Well, thank you, Brian. It's been fascinating.
Thank you.
One last question from anyone before we go to breakouts. No? Okay. Well, Brian, thank you so much. I think you've given us enough information to probably fuel 2 or 3 of these sessions to think through. And so I know I'm looking forward to chatting about it in a breakout group in just a moment. Brian, do you think what might be, if there's some sort of takeaway or homework for people to do? I know you've given us lots of ideas, but is there something you could point us to, something you suggest we look at, read? Is there, any final word that you'd recommend?
Yeah, Peter, there are a few. I mean, I would say just to think of this loop from a personal context. So first thing is, where am I on this loop? And second is, what can I do about it? And again, I think part of what you can do about it is increasingly understanding what it is you love to do, and to reorient yourself personally and professionally, ideally both, into increasing that. And secondly, I think the deeper work is understanding those needs and how to get those needs met healthily. And as Kokong says, it's not simple, but I do think it's work that is important to do.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you. Well, we might at this point just wish you a good day.
Yeah, thank you.
And yeah, hopefully not the last time that we see you in the transition group.
Great. Thank you, guys. Apologies if I dumped so heavily on you all. I get excited about this stuff, but thank you for participating and look forward to, and please feel free if you'd like to reach out and chat further. This is what I love to do. This is the way I'm wired, and really happy to add any more value if you feel that's if it's needed. Thanks, Peter.